Hi, St. Mark's. The past couple of weeks, I've talked about the hymns from Wales and from Germany. And this week, I would like to start what will probably take a few weeks to talk about hymns from England. Of course, as Episcopalians, we come from the Church of England, so much of our hymnal comes from that country. As I mentioned a while back in the Meter and Hymns video, the basis for congregational singing in England originated on the continent of Europe, and in Germany and also in Switzerland, especially in Geneva. Martin Luther, who I talked about extensively last week, was the first one to try to come up with a way for the congregation to be able to sing psalms in the daily office. But previously, this had been done exclusively by the clergy or the choir or by monks in a monastery. So, having been an Augustinian monk, Martin Luther decided to try using the psalm tones that he had sung in his time in the monastery. However, for some reason, this did not catch on well with Lutheran congregations. So Martin Luther went back to the drawing board and came up with a new way of doing this. He decided to write metrical versions of the psalms that would fit into a chorale structure, fit that meter that we talked about in the previous video. And this made it much easier for congregations to sing the psalms. Famously, Martin Luther is associated with Wittenberg, and those first Lutheran congregations there were perhaps the first to experience this new version of psalm singing, and it spread throughout the Lutheran congregations in Germany, but it flourished especially in Strasbourg. French reformer and theologian John Calvin ended up pastoring a congregation of French speakers in the city of Strasbourg. There, he met with the German-speaking Protestants and learned from them about their tradition of singing psalms. So he started to produce French versions of the psalms in metrical texts for his congregation. Our current hymnal has one example of a hymn from this Strasbourg period when John Calvin was there. It's hymn number 429, and the tune is Old 113th. And you'll notice as I go through this video that a lot of these tune names start with the word old, followed by a number, like Old 113th, Old 100th. And that refers to the psalms that they were originally or famously associated with. Now, maybe that caught you by surprise. The first phrase of this hymn is very similar to another hymn that we know as Lasst uns erfreuen today. This was sort of an early version of that hymn, and they eventually diverged and became separate tunes. John Calvin didn't spend too long in Strasbourg because he is most famous for his time in Geneva, Switzerland, working with French Protestants there. It was here that he published his Genevan liturgy. It's called La Forme des Prières et Chants Ecclesiastiques, published in 1542. This Genevan liturgy expanded on the Psalter that he wrote while he was in Strasbourg. It also included texts by Clément Marot. Hold on to that name, he'll come back in a little bit. Calvin also wrote metrical texts, not only of the Psalms, but of other portions of Scripture. He regarded theology as primary and flowery language as secondary. After Marot's death in 1544, Calvin teamed up with Theodore Beza to continue this translation of the Psalter. In 1551, half of the Psalter had been translated, and a new collection was published. This is called the Psaumes Octantois de David. And Louis Bourgeois was the musical editor for this. You'll see his name on many of the hymns in our hymnal. There are two examples in particular. One is hymn 404, and this is called Old 124th. And one of the most famous hymn tunes in the English-speaking world actually comes from this collection. It's Old 100th. You hear it a lot at St. Mark's. Now hold on to that tune because it will come back later in the video as well. 11 years later, in 1562, the complete French Psalter was published. It was called Les Psaumes mis en rime par Clément Marot et Théodore Bessa. Remember I speak German, not French. This collection contained all 150 psalms, written in 110 different meters, and was compiled with 125 tunes. Of course, I've been talking about Wittenberg in Germany and Strasbourg in Germany and Geneva in Switzerland, but how did these tunes make their way all the way up to England? And the answer is kind of complicated. So hold on, this is kind of some interesting history. But first off, you have to remember that Germany was not unified as a single nation until 1871. Before this time, it was a collection of principalities, and within these principalities, they all spoke German. So it was the language that united them. In England, King Henry VIII attempted to align himself with the Lutheran princes in these areas. He saw a political advantage, and this led to a cultural exchange of ideas between the Protestant church that he was attempting to set up in England and the Protestantism that was taking hold in Germany. By the 1530s, Miles Coverdale had already began translating German chorales into English. Coverdale's translation of the Psalter was included in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and is still used today because the 1662 BCP is the standard in England, and it is the standard that even our prayer book attempts to conform to. Coverdale's translations of the Psalms were put into a collection called Ghostly Psalms and Spiritual Songs. It was published in London in 1535. I'll be sure to put that text down below because I love this Old English spellings. We have one example from this time period. It is hymn 634 in our hymnal today. It's called Ich ruf zu dir, I cry to you. In time, King Henry VIII no longer saw the point in these political allegiances with these principalities in Germany, so he pulled away from them, and at home, he also gathered up all of these collections of Coverdale's translations and burned them. Later in the reign of King Henry VIII, Thomas Sternhold began to write poetic versions of the Psalms in English. Sternhold was a member of the royal court, and at this time, English courtiers really valued French fashion, everything from clothing to food to music. And these courtiers flowed back and forth between France and England. Now remember, a few minutes ago, I mentioned Clément Marot, who had assisted John Calvin with the Psalms. Marot was a member of the French court, so Sternhold and Marot likely met each other and exchanged ideas. And Sternhold encountered Marot's Psalter and began writing in that style. Sternhold's psalms were written to be sung easily to pre-existing melodies, and they were frequently in the meter 8/6, 8/6, or common meter. Now, this meter was not exactly so common at this time, and it is highly likely that common meter became common because of Sternhold's work. In fact, in the 1550s, this meter wasn't called common meter, but Sternhold's meter. At the time of King Henry VIII's death, only 19 of the 150 psalms were translated, and they were collected into a book called Certain Psalms Chosen Out of the Psalter of David and Drawn into English Meter by Thomas Sternhold, Groom of ye king's majesty's robes. Check that spelling, it's great. This was in 1547. Sternhold died before he was able to complete the whole Psalter. All of the Psalms he was able to complete, with a few by Hopkins, were collected into a collection called All Such Psalms of David as T. Sternhold did in his lifetime draw into English meter, newly imprinted. This was published in London in 1549. 1549 is also the same year that the first Book of Common Prayer was published. Henry VIII was succeeded by Edward VI. He died in 1553, and at that point, all attempts of writing in the vernacular were stopped because Queen Mary took the throne. Queen Mary I took the throne, and she was Edward's half-sister and a staunch Roman Catholic. She prohibited the prayer book. The Latin Mass was reintroduced. Medieval heresy laws were reenacted. Some reformers, such as Thomas Cranmer and Nicholas Ridley, remained in England to try to hold together what they had begun, this Protestant movement in England. However, they did not meet very good ends. Ridley, who had been the Bishop of London, was burned at the stake as one of the Oxford martyrs. And 6 months later, Cranmer was burned in the same place. While Cranmer and Ridley and their companions stayed behind in England, others fled the country for fear of their lives. Their religious beliefs were too important for them, and they needed to find a place to practice those religious beliefs. So they fled to places like Strasbourg, Basel, Emden, Frankfurt, Basel, Zurich, Geneva, and other parts of the continent. They worshipped mainly from the Edwardian prayer book from 1552. They sang from the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. In Strasbourg, translations of the German chorales supplemented the hymns. One example of a chorale that would have been sung in Strasbourg in English with a German tune is hymn number 575. The tune name is Vater unser in Himmelreich, which translated to Our Father in Heaven. It was Martin Luther's German translation of the Lord's Prayer. In Basel, the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalters were expanded into a collection called the Psalms of David in meter. It was published in 1555 or 1556 and included a total of 51 metrical psalms and several metrical canticles, including the Vater unser from Strasbourg. In Frankfurt, the exile congregation was divided between those who wanted to remain faithful to the Book of Common Prayer and those who wanted to follow a more Calvinistic way of worshiping, using the Genevan liturgy. They eventually split, and the BCP worshippers remained in Frankfurt, and the more Calvinist members of the congregation ended up moving to Geneva. Soon after arriving in Geneva, the translated Calvinist liturgy was published along with a revision of the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. Upon the death of Queen Mary in 1558, Elizabeth I ascended to the throne. Elizabeth was Mary's half-sister, and Elizabeth quickly undid all of the changes that Mary had enacted. In 1559, Elizabeth issued a new edition of the Book of Common Prayer. English exiles heard about this Protestant queen on the throne and decided to return to their homeland. They brought with them these psalters that they had written and revised while on the continent. And the Genevan Psalms and the Strasbourg Psalms, along with all of the other things that they had translated, came together in a book. And this book is called The Whole Book of Psalms Collected into English Meter by T. Sternhold, I. Hopkins, and others, conferred with the Hebrew with apt notes to sing them withal. It was published in London in 1562. This collection was so popular that it was used in England well into the 19th century. So from 1562 to the mid-19th century, these were used widely in England. Although many Protestants who had fled England to the continent found this new safe haven in their homeland, others found that England was still hostile to their religious ideas. This is where the Puritans enter English history. And Puritans decided first to go to the Netherlands to seek refuge from what was happening in England at the time. Eventually, some Puritan separatists from Amsterdam sailed back toward England, and they met with some other Puritans who were still in England and sailed to the New World. They were on the Mayflower, of course, in 1620. And they brought with them a psalter written by Henry Ainsworth in the Netherlands. Ainsworth's psalter attempted to improve on those of Sternhold and Hopkins with regard to faithfulness to Scripture. Only 20 years after landing at Plymouth Rock, these Puritan colonists published their first metrical psalter. It's referred to as the Bay Psalm Book, but the official title was The Whole Book of Psalms Faithfully Translated into English Meter. It was published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640. Over the next century, the Bay Psalm Book became the basis of psalm singing in New England, Old England, and Scotland by Puritan reformers. In England, there was a period called the Commonwealth period. It was a time when the monarchy was abolished and this new Commonwealth government was installed. It didn't last very long, and the monarchy was eventually restored. And after 2 years of debate, a new version of the Book of Common Prayer was published in 1662. This is still the official Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England. When this new edition of the Book of Common Prayer came out in 1662, Sternhold and Hopkins' Psalter was restored to its place alongside this new Book of Common Prayer. However, after some debate, there was some question about whether there was any official authorization for these psalms. And they realized there wasn't, and it was simply the default because it had just sort of been collected over the years. So Nicholas Brady and Nahum Tate sought permission of King William III to produce an official psalm translation, and this came about in 1696. Brady and Tate's Psalter became known as the New Version, and Sternhold and Hopkins became known as the Old Version. However, before the New Version was published, it received criticisms for its treatment of some psalms. It was revised twice in 1698 before it was actually accepted. If any of you have ever been to London, there's a beautiful church in Trafalgar Square called the Church of St. Martin in the Fields. And St. Martin in the Fields was the first church to adopt this new version of the Psalms. And just as an aside, this church is famous today for not only its music tradition, they have a wonderful concert series there, but they're also known for their outreach to the homeless and the vulnerable in the city of London. In the United States, Trinity Church in New York City was the first church to adopt the new version of the Psalms. The Bishop of London was actually the bishop of all territories outside of England. So the Bishop of London was also the Bishop of New York and of Massachusetts and the whole New England, northeast of the U.S. area. In 1789, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States was created. And when it was created, it authorized the new version of Psalms by Brady and Tate as its official psalter. We have an example from this psalter. It's hymn number 658. The hymn tune is Martyrdom. So at this point, we are up to the 18th century, and we've talked exclusively about metrical psalm translations. That's enough for this week. We'll be back. We'll continue talking about psalm translations and other hymns in future Music Mondays. I'll end this week's Music Monday by playing Henry Purcell's Voluntary on the 100th Psalm tune. I hope you enjoy it. It's a familiar tune to all of you. And Henry Purcell, by the way, was the organist at Westminster Abbey, so this may have been played there at some point. I hope you enjoy this first segment of Hymns in England, and we'll see you soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.